Is the Supreme Court in America able to transform our nation's culture and values in just a few decades? Not only did that happen, but the transformation from a Christian culture to a secular humanist one has had devastating effects. In this video, I'll expose some truths to you that few Americans are aware of. You won't want to miss it. Welcome to Part 5, the final video from our series, America's Christian Foundations. I provide a recap of Parts 1 through 4 in the description below, with links to each video. In earlier episodes, we talked briefly about the 1947 Everson case and how the Supreme Court twisted the original meaning of the phrase separation of church and state. Now we'll take a closer look at this case because it became the precedent for future cases used by the court to remove Christianity from our nation's public schools. Here's the backstory. Buckle up, kiddos! A New Jersey school district provided reimbursement to parents who used public transportation to get their kids to and from school. This reimbursement was given regardless of the type of school. Some students were attending private religious schools. One taxpayer objected on the grounds that the New Jersey law violated the constitutional prohibition against state support of religion. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the plaintiff, stating, "The First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve the slightest breach." As we explained in Part 3, the phrase separation of church and state has origins dating back to the 17th century with Baptist minister Roger Williams of Rhode Island. Williams had maintained that a wall of separation existed to protect the church from the state. Williams, a Baptist, had been oppressed by the Anglicans in New England. They wanted him to pay tithes to the Anglican Church, which he refused to do. He was banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony and started the colony of Rhode Island, where there was true religious liberty. Fast forward to the early 19th century. On October 7, 1801, the Danbury Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut wrote a letter to President Thomas Jefferson. They expressed their concern that the First Amendment might be interpreted to imply that the right to freedom of religion was granted by government, when in fact it was inalienable, that is, God-given and unalterable. President Jefferson agreed with their views of the dangers of power in government and assured them that the First Amendment was indeed intended to protect their inalienable right, and he emphasized that a wall of separation was in place to protect the church from the state. We've got to remember that this wall was intended to protect the church from the state. Jefferson used the phrase borrowed from Roger Williams because he was addressing Baptists who were very familiar with Williams' teaching on the subject. Yeah, we know that guy. In the 1947 Everson case, the Supreme Court borrowed the phrase from Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists. Yet they only used that one phrase about the wall of separation completely out of context and ignored the rest of Jefferson's letter. In essence, the court reinterpreted separation of church and state to mean that Christianity could no longer influence the state, contrary to the intentions of the Founding Fathers, including Thomas Jefferson, and contrary to 160 years of American history. The congressional records from June 7th to September 25th, 1789, record the months of discussions and debates of the 90 Founding Fathers who framed the First Amendment. Significantly, not only was Thomas Jefferson not one of those 90, but also during those debates, not one of those framers mentioned the phrase separation of church and state. Zero, zilch, nada! In the early 1960s, the Supreme Court used the Everson case from 1947 as justification for banning school prayer and Bible reading in public schools. 1962, Engel versus Vitale was a landmark United States Supreme Court case in which the court ruled that it is unconstitutional for state officials to compose an official school prayer and encourage its recitation in public schools. The New York school system had adopted a prayer to be said before the start of each day's classes. This prayer was to help promote good moral character of the students, spiritual training, and help combat juvenile delinquency. This is an outrage! The regents wrote a prayer for the schools, which had to be non-sectarian and non-denominational. Here's the prayer. Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. Karl Marx would not approve. Justice Hugo Black wrote the following for the 6-1 majority. It is no part of the business of government to compose official prayers. The Regents' prayer are inconsistent both with the purposes of the Establishment Clause and the Establishment Clause itself. This ruling was made contrary to 160 years of children praying in public schools in America. 1963, Abington School District versus Schempp was a United States Supreme Court case in which the court decided 8-1 in favor of the respondent, Edward Schempp, and declared school-sponsored Bible reading in public schools in the United States to be unconstitutional. Again, this ruling was made despite the framers of the First Amendment advocating the use of the Bible in public education and its use in schools for over 160 years. Remember, in part 2 of this series, we gave overwhelming proof that our founding fathers advocated the use of the Bible in public schools. So how could we go from prayer and Bible reading in public schools being perfectly constitutional one day and unconstitutional the next? The secular humanists on the Supreme Court were practitioners of relative truth. I highly suggest you watch our videos explaining secular humanism and relative truth that we'll link to, so you can understand the underlying ideology behind these anti-Christian decisions. Check them out. In several court cases since the early 1960s, the humanists on the Supreme Court have continued to twist the meaning of the First Amendment. Let's examine several of those now. In Stone v. Graham in 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that the posting of a copy of the Ten Commandments in a public school classroom in the state has no secular legislative purpose, and therefore is unconstitutional as violating the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. They went on to state, if the posted copies of the Ten Commandments are to have any effect at all, it will be to induce the school children to read, meditate upon, and perhaps to venerate and obey the commandments. Imagine the horror of America's public school students being taught to obey their parents, not harm others, not steal, not lie, and not lust after things they're not entitled to have. As we'll see at the end of this presentation, the decline in American morality since the early 1960s, when those humanists kicked God out of our schools, is shocking and sad. Incidentally, to show the court's hypocrisy, their ruling against the Ten Commandments was made despite the fact that a depiction of Moses in the Ten Commandments exists in the Supreme Court building. Here is an excerpt from a 1975 official U.S. Supreme Court handbook prepared under the direction of Mark Cannon, administrative assistant to the Chief Justice. It said, directly above the bench are two central figures depicting majesty of law and power of government. Between them is a tableau of the Ten Commandments. Yet on tours given today at the Supreme Court building, people are told by the tour guides that the tablets represent the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. This is an excellent example of humanists rewriting history to manipulate citizens. We can trust the government. In Wallace v. Jaffrey in 1985, the Supreme Court ruled Alabama's law permitting 1 minute for prayer or meditation was unconstitutional. If you read that decision, you'll note that the justices point out that they were really just trying to sneak prayer back into the public schools. In Lee v. Wiseman in 1992, the court prohibited clergy-led prayer at middle school graduation ceremonies. Lee v. Wiseman, in turn, was a basis for Santa Fe ISD v. Doe in 2000, in which the court extended the ban to school-organized student-led prayer at high school football games. American culture changed dramatically after the Supreme Court decisions of the early 1960s and following, which essentially banned the Christian consensus from public education, replacing it with secular humanism. Ironically, the U.S. Supreme Court cited secular humanism as a religion in the 1961 case of Torcaso v. Watkins. For nearly 100 years, humanists considered their beliefs a type of religion to be afforded the same rights and protections as legitimate religions in the United States. John Dewey described humanism as our common faith. Julian Huxley called it religion without revelation. The first Humanist Manifesto spoke openly of humanism as a religion. Not until after Christians started to challenge humanists as violating the Constitution with the promotion of their religion in public schools did humanists insist that humanism was not really a religion after all. Remember relative truth? Truth is what we say it is. For over 70 years, history in public schools has been revised to reflect a Marxist humanist worldview and produce a particular type of citizen who will embrace Marxist humanist ideals. How successful has this propaganda campaign been? According to a Newsmax article from November 29, 2025, the new Rasmussen poll found that 51% of voters aged 18 to 39 want a Democratic Socialist to win the 2028 presidential election. Among young Democrats, 82% favored a Democratic Socialist. Among young Republicans, 35% were in favor. In a moment, we'll look at some changes that have occurred in America since our nation rejected the Christian consensus in the early 1960s and embraced the secular humanist worldview. That'll be interesting. First, let's do a topic-by-topic comparison of these two worldviews. Then we'll better understand the statistics I'm going to reveal later. We'll focus on the 10 Commandments that were removed from schools and replaced with secular humanist ideology. We'll share the 10 Commandments as espoused when America held to a Christian consensus. Then we'll contrast that with the secular humanist view. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. The result? God and his laws are valued in society. The secular humanist contract based on man's reasoning? The state is the higher power. The result? The state decides who and what has value. Here's another one. Honor thy father and thy mother. The result? America consisted of traditional families with parents having control over their children's upbringing, and they learned to respect authority. The secular humanist contrast based on man's reasoning? The state or collective controls the children. The result? Abolish traditional family roles. The collective raises children in government-run daycares, preschools, and public schools to indoctrinate them. Here's another. Thou shalt not kill. The result? God is the author of life, and murder is evil and wrong. The secular humanist contrast based on man's reasoning? Murder is acceptable for the sake of the collective. The result? Abortion, euthanasia, mass murder are all moral. For example, the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, Communist China, North Korea, and the American abortion mills. Here's yet another. Thou shalt not commit adultery. The result? The traditional family is honored and protected. No broken homes, fatherless children, poverty, and so forth. The secular humanist contrast based on man's reasoning? Moral relativism. There are no moral absolutes. If it feels good, do it. The results? High divorce rates, broken homes, fatherless homes, increased poverty. All of these lead to more dependency on the state. That's the idea. It's why our government has promoted anti-family laws for decades to enable greater government control over American households. Here's another. Thou shalt not steal. The result? Private property rights are preserved and protected. The secular humanist contrast based on man's reasoning? All property belongs to the state. The result? Confiscation of private property to fund social programs controlled by the state. Property crimes against individuals are lightly punished, if at all. Here's another. Thou shalt not bear false witness. The result? Absolute truth. Reality exists. Truth never changes. A is A and lying is wrong. The secular humanist contrast based on man's reasoning? Man decides what truth is. The result? Relative truth. What is true today might not be true in the future. A is B, or anything else the state declares it to be. And here's yet another. Thou shalt not covet. The result? Avoiding preoccupation with what belongs to others, it discourages envy, theft, and violence. The secular humanist contrast based on man's reasoning? Lusting at what belongs to others is perfectly fine. The result? Marxist economic policies are imposed by the state to confiscate property from those who earned it and give it to those who have not worked. So now we've seen some concrete examples of the differences between the two opposing worldviews. Those humanists are nasty. Since the early 1960s, prayer, Bible reading, the Ten Commandments, and so forth have been banned in public schools and replaced with secular humanist thought. How has American society changed since the early 1960s when the humanist Marxist ideology took control? Criminal arrest of teens is up 150% according to the U.S. Bureau of Census. Teen suicides for ages 15 to 19 years are up 450% according to the National Center of Health Services. Illegal drug activity is up 6,000% according to the National Institute of Drug Abuse. Why? Drugs help people escape reality. Child abuse cases are up 2,300% according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Divorce is up 350% according to the U.S. Department of Commerce. SAT scores have fallen even though the SAT questions have been revamped to be easier to answer. Today, 1 in 4 parents living with a child in the United States are unmarried. A half-century ago, fewer than 1 in 10 parents living with their children were unmarried. Research released by the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey says that states with a higher percentage of out-of-wedlock births in 2011 tended to have a higher incidence of poverty. 72% of adults were married in 1960. Only 51% of adults are married today. 2% of Americans had no religious affiliation in 1960. 14% do not identify with any religion today. I recommend watching the Andy Griffith Show and Leave It to Beaver if you'd like a snapshot of American culture before the decline of the Christian consensus. These shows are not perfect, but they will give you a good example of what it was like. The classic Christmas movie It's a Wonderful Life starring James Stewart and Donna Reed is also a great reference in this regards. When there are two sides to a story and one side is attempting to use lies, manipulation, and force to keep you from hearing the other side, what does that tell you about them? In the free marketplace of ideas, the better idea can withstand the scrutiny of thorough examination. Bad ideas cannot, and thus it behooves the promoters of bad ideas to try and silence all opposition. Think about it. What I've shared with you in this video are well-documented historical facts. Since these facts cannot be disputed, the humanists attempt to discredit those sharing these facts. They use terms like bigot, hater, or fascist to discredit those who hold to a Christian worldview. Their ad hominem attacks are proof that their arguments have no substance, so they try to discredit their ideological opponents. That's why progressive educators are trying to discredit the Founding Fathers with all kinds of lies about them. If the Founding Fathers can be made to look evil, then the important documents they created can be dismissed as irrelevant. Can you believe those fools? Then the secular humanist Marxists can introduce their sugar-coated poison ideology to the ignorant masses. Let's review what we learned in this video. The term separation of church and state was originally used by a Baptist minister named Roger Williams. Williams advocated for the biblical concept of the church being free from interference by the state. His phrase was quoted by Thomas Jefferson to calm the fears of the Danbury Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut, regarding government interference in church affairs. In 1947, the Supreme Court took Jefferson's use of the term out of context and twisted the meaning of the separation of church and state phrase. Subsequent courts, led by secular humanists, used the 1947 case to further remove Christian influence from our nation's public schools. This had a domino effect, and the Christian consensus in America became a thing of the past, with secular humanism replacing it. With Americans embracing secular humanist ideology, we have suffered a great deal in terms of cultural and moral decline. We provided you with some facts from several legitimate sources which serve to document this decline since the 1960s when God was removed from public schools. So what can be done about it? If you're not a Christian, watch the video linked to in the description below. With Christ as your Savior, you'll not only sleep better knowing you'll have a home in heaven someday, you'll also understand the concepts taught in the videos on this channel better as well. For the first time in your life, you'll have a sense of spiritual discernment you've never known before. Why is that? 1 Corinthians 2:14 tells us, "But the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness unto him. Neither can he know them, because they are spiritually discerned." I hope you've enjoyed our 5-part series, America's Christian Foundations. Ensure you watch any videos in the series you may have missed. Look for other videos on our channel to better help you understand what is happening in America today. Until then, I've listed some resources in the video description below for documentation and to assist you with further study. Remember, the information presented here at the Dan Perspective channel is very important. Please help us to get the truth out to our fellow Americans. Like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, hit the bell for notifications, and share the video with others. Feel free to leave a comment. Words of encouragement are always appreciated, as well as helpful input on how we can improve our content. Finally, if you're not 100% certain you're going to heaven someday, check out the video linked to below as soon as possible. Until next time, thank you for watching, and remember Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Thank you again, and goodbye.